black horse, which neighed and stamped with impatience. "Tom, you're come for," said the black fellow gruffly. Tom shrank back, but too late. He had left his little Bible at the bottom of his coat pocket, and his big Bible on the desk buried under the mortgage he was about to foreclose. Never was sinner taken more unawares. The black man whisked him like a child into the saddle, gave the horse the lash, and away he galloped, with Tom on his back, in the midst of the thunderstorm. The clerks struck their pins behind their ears and stared after him from the windows. Away went Tom Walker, dashing down the streets, his white cap bobbing up and down, his morning gown fluttering in the wind, and his steed striking fire out of the pavement with every bound. When the clerks turned to look for the black man, he had disappeared. Tom Walker never returned to foreclose the mortgage. A countryman who lived on the border of the swamp reported that in the height of the thundergust, he had heard a great clattering of hooves and a howling along the road, and, running to the window, caught sight of a figure, such as I have described, on a horse that galloped like mad across the fields, over the hills, and down into the black hemlock swamp toward the old Indian fort, and that shortly after a thunderbolt falling in that direction seemed to set the whole forest in a blaze. The good people of Boston shook their heads and shrugged their shoulders, but had been so much accustomed to witches and goblins and tricks of the devil in all kinds of shapes from the first settlement of the colony that they were not so much horror-struck as might have been expected. Trustees were appointed to take charge of Tom's effects. There was nothing, however, to administer upon. On searching his coffers, all his bonds and mortgages were found reduced to cinders. In place of gold and silver, his iron chest was filled with chips and shavings. 2 skeletons lay in his stable instead of his half-starved horses, and the very next day, his great house took fire and burnt to the ground. Such was the end of Tom Walker and his ill-gotten wealth. Let all griping money brokers lay this story to heart. The truth of it is not to be doubted. The very hole under the oak trees whence he dug kids' money is to be seen to this day, and the neighboring swamp and old Indian fort are often haunted in stormy nights by a figure on horseback, in morning gown and white cap, which is doubtless the troubled spirit of the usurer. In fact, the story has resolved itself into a proverb, and is the origin of that popular saying so prevalent through New England of the devil and Tom Walker. Well, there you go. There is The Devil and Tom Walker by Washington Irving. It's based on the German legend of Faust, which was also about a man who sold his soul to the devil. But as you saw there, and as far as I'm concerned, Washington Irving did a very good job of taking this old German legend and remaking it for the American setting and for American audiences. I also find it kind of interesting that, again, the story was published in 1824, and he has the devil admit that slavery is his business. And Tom, as bad as he is, refuses to become a slave trader. That was a pretty interesting and pretty progressive view to have in 1824. And sure, the story does kind of ply on this idea that the Native Americans were devil worshippers, but that was an idea that had been around since the Pilgrims, who viewed everything through their religious lens. And it was an idea that the audience in 1824 could more easily suspend their disbelief for. But it is at heart a fantasy story, so it is what it is. And it is a product of 1824. And, despite those things, I still find it quite enjoyable, and I still find it very entertaining. And it's interesting, too, because it has a great deal of humor The idea of a man selling his soul to the devil is, a pretty serious theme, but there's a lot of humor. Like, Tom himself doesn't seem that fazed by anything that happens, and his reaction to his wife being murdered is, pretty nonchalant. So it's dark humor, but it's still humor nonetheless. And it's one of the reasons why I enjoy the story so much. And one of the things I enjoy about Irving's work overall is that he kind of taps into this primal feeling that I get myself whenever I go into the woods. And I enjoy going into wooded areas and just being around the trees and the animals and the living things. But it can also be eerie sometimes, and I think that he does a good job of tapping into that, especially in this story where there is so much supernatural stuff going on in the forest. Well, I hope you enjoyed that story. I know I did. And I hope you will join me next time. And until then, keep reading.